have to in one end listen to where there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that our outcomes, like more effort, persistence, enjoyment, even performance in some isolated case studies, to do with more internal drivers. But then it's back to the coach's side of it. We need to remember that any motivator can be useful if it's used appropriately.
Be the best rugby coach you can be. Welcome to Rugby Coach Weekly Podcast with head coach Dan Cottrell, where you learn hints and tips from the rugby coaching community. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Rugby Coach Weekly Podcast with me, Dan Cottrell. I'm delighted to welcome onto the podcast Dr. Mark Carroll. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Dan. I've really enjoyed listening to your show recently. Just the other day, actually, with Dave Collins one, which was a great episode. Got me actually thinking about our role, perhaps, maybe as, hosted podcasts, which is in the role we play, perhaps, in disseminating correct information. So, yeah, there you go, there's a wee plug straight away. But I'm really happy to be here and to chat about coaching.
Well, I came across Mark because he runs a podcast called The Labours of Sports Coaching. And just before I released the podcast with a guy called Mark Williams, he did his own with Mark, showing that Mark is in demand. And we had a bit of back and forth and decided that we did actually like each other and he wasn't sneaking in with that. So that was interesting. We might talk about that a little bit later on. So Mark is a sports coach and lecturer at the University of West of Scotland. And he was a coach before he went into academia. I've also said he is the host of the Labours of Sports Coaching. We might mention that as we're going to go through, but we're going to talk a little bit about coach behaviors and in particular how a coach motivates their athletes. So perhaps some of the myths and reality. So over to you, Mark. Let's dig into the myths. What are the myths about motivating athletes from a coach's point of view?
Yeah, and again, keep me right here because there is plenty that we could maybe chat about here. I suppose we might start on maybe the premise that I think you established in the very first thing you said there about almost the role of the coach. So I view coaching from a motivational or a self-determination theory lens more specifically often, when I think it's appropriate to do so. And that is sort of predicated on this assumption that perhaps we shouldn't see the coach as the motivator, and then perhaps the coach's role isn't to be the external motivator, but rather to create an environment through which the athlete learns to motivate themselves.
All right.
So,
Okay. So what we're saying is that we shouldn't even start with how does the coach motivate the athlete. That may be the wrong starting point.
well, it could be if you're going to go off of what textbooks say all the time. In my professional opinion, insofar as from the accumulation of experiences and working as a coach for many years, I would say that it depends again, perhaps. But sometimes you should be the external motivator. I absolutely believe that. I don't think there's any reason to not to be shy in saying that. And but there is also times that there has been a lot of sort of empirical evidence to suggest that internal drivers across a longer period of time can often lead to more adaptive outcomes for athletes. So it's always just a case of the tensions, I suppose, being present in that relationship and how we sort of which side we move between as we need to as we go forward.
So when you say externally motivate, I think I understand what that means is I will say, Mark, get a wiggle on, you've got to be faster.
Yeah, yeah, to a point. So I suppose if you, I can give a bit of a whistle stop tour, I suppose, in some of the ways in which we might view motivation or a continuum. So, an athlete who, does their sport for the pure intrinsic love and interest in it, that's a very pure form of, it's in its name, intrinsic motivation. That's extremely internally led. But then you've got the athlete who maybe partakes in activities linked to the sport that they see value through, but they don't necessarily enjoy intrinsically in the most natural sense. So that might be, that rugby kid who is in the gym and they don't necessarily like lifting weights, but they appreciate the link between lifting weights and performing in rugby.
So it's
Um,
interesting you say see value. So if you see value, is that an intrinsic motivator then?
so it would be. it would be termed as so I mean the technical term for this would be like identified regulation. So we would see that as it is still it is still more towards the more internally driven side than it is would necessarily be extrinsic, but it isn't the most pure form of its of intrinsic motivation. And in the way that we might view motivation, if again if we stay on this sort of continuum that self-determination theory helps us understand it through, it's not necessarily assuming that everyone has only has the most purest forms of motivation towards a sport, and it's not necessarily trying to say either that we can't have more extrinsic reasons for doing things, but just what's the overriding reason for why we do things, or across, we might term almost as our motivational orientation. Is it more geared towards more internal drivers, like as I say, interest, enjoyment, like as I say, identifying value in it, or even and this is sort of a one that I've actually jumped across there, identified regulation, where it's a more integrated form of regulation, where it's actually about how you see it as being part of who you are. So those things kind of happen simultaneously. Then you might move further down that spectrum or continuum to actually partaking in activity, and it is internally driven, but it's done through a sort of guilt, perhaps, because you don't want to let people down.
Yep.
So it's your drive and your behavior, but it's still externally sort of influenced. So it sort of then moves over that boundary into more external drivers of behavior to
So
then
just not, I'm interested on that guilt thing because certainly we've felt guilt about that, but there's also that driver, that anger driver. So it's like the sort of the letters that people show once they've made it, and they say this kid will fail and never achieve anything, and then you've read it and said that's it, I'm going to go off and prove them wrong. Where does that fit in that sort of guilt
it could
motive?
do. Yeah, I suppose it could do. Yeah, could essentially your behavior has been still prompted by some sort of external influence, but you're then using that and I suppose like using that and redirecting that as positive energy. So yeah, and this is the weird thing as we say this, don't see this as necessarily a when I'm talking through this continuum, I wouldn't necessarily suggest that it's a developmental curve where we need to necessarily move from external into more internal drivers, because like what you've just suggested there, like I want to prove somebody wrong. Again, there's a difference between the more sort of flowery view and how we might hope an athlete is influenced, but that's a really powerful motivator. So like
Mm.
anger and these things are, and if we talk about what an emotionally intelligent athlete is, that's an athlete as well who's capable of utilizing otherwise negative emotions and pushing it towards something that's more productive. So that's the funny thing. Actually, just for clarity as well, that when I mentioned around character and how you might see your in, partaking in activities being part of who you are an athlete. That's actually what we might call integrated regulation, not identified. I just repeated that
Mm.
term twice there. And then you've got the final end of that continuum. So we've moved from a really intrinsic driver, and it's so really sort of prototypical form of just love and enjoyment, to having that more guilt influence, to then what's even further behind that and closer to the extrinsic end of the spectrum would be where you're just doing it for a reward, or you're doing it because you want to avoid a punishment.
Mm.
So again, we often, our players will sit in all of these spaces at different times. But again, a self-determination theory lens would suggest that we want to try and push them and ensure that our environment is sending signals to the athlete for why they're there and why they take part, for reasons that are more to do with internal drivers than the more external drivers, to a point. And that's where, again, and we'll get into this a little bit more, there's a separation here in conversation from what the framework suggests and what there is some empirical evidence to suggest could be helpful to a point, and actually the craft knowledge of knowing when we should actually exploit all the different drivers that an athlete can use to, push themselves forward, and if you use the coach to achieve sort of good outcomes for them in your relationship.
If I was interviewing somebody to try and understand what their motivation was, how effective would the research be? Because by sheer chance, I asked this question of a young man this morning, um, and we were talking about money as a motivator, and they said, oh yeah, back when I did my GCSEs, I was offered money from to get better GCSEs. And I said, did it make a difference? Now, obviously, I wasn't a scientist in terms of wasn't researching properly. I could have asked a better question. But when we came out at the end of it, we weren't certain between us whether that was a key motivator or not. So, how can you, when you're researching this, understand where people are actually on the spectrum? I think everyone's listening in will understand
Mm,
all those
mm.
emotions,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
what does actually when you say it, oh, someone will say, oh yeah, that's me, because they're the sort of recency bias of that sounds like me, so I'll go with that.
Mm.
How do we find this out?
Yeah, I mean, well, the reasons why we do things, it's dynamic and it's live, isn't it? So people are complicated. So as that's like kind of going back to what I was saying there and not seeing it so much like a developmental curve where we're trying to move it. We're constantly jumping back and forward at different times, and what influences that is the environmental circumstance, you know. So and that is again prone to change because of maybe outcomes that an athlete achieves to then that changes their next level of motivation. So that's I think they put this in really simple terms. That could be a kid who starts playing the game of rugby because they love it, to then the kid that actually because they've got really good at it and they start to look at it as a potential career, they might then start to actually have visions of, you know what, buying their mum a house. So, you know, all of a sudden then we've had a change in behaviour, motivation from a more internal driver as being the dominant influence to maybe it's still there. And again, it's not this black and white thing that I say that we leave one world to fully occupy another. It's still there, but now then we start to see, you know, tangible rewards starting to come into maybe the athlete's thinking. And and what I would probably say, I'd put the question back onto you, Dan, or at least in terms of just thinking rhetorically here, but I don't actually think as the coach we need to be so concerned about what someone's motivation tells us about them. I think what we need to care more about is how we use what motivates them in a way that's productive for the shared goals that we have with them. So, and this
Oh,
is
so
one of
that's right. Can I just interrupt there? So
yeah.
I love that idea. Now, if you've studied motivation, the science of motivation, you've read around it, you're going to be more of an expert than a general coach. So what I would worry about here is trying to understand what motivates players. Now, there'll be people on listening into this podcast who've been involved a bit in professional, semi-professional sport, and everyone in the team gets the same reward, to a certain extent, money or cups, as everybody else. Yet we're asking ourselves to understand the players. So how can I understand a player's motivation? What sort of things do I need to be doing as as you're saying to get more from this situation rather than just saying there is a spectrum and these are the sorts of things which may work.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I think this part of the answer to this is probably just finishing the point I was on there around
Mm.
because we both as we can as coaches we can consult athletes on motivation, but well we still need to appreciate that in our interactions with our athletes we also create their motivation. So it's never I think something that's fully um can be fully bounded in that way because of just the fact that there's a reciprocal relationship happening there where the athlete affects the coach affects the athlete. So I'll give you an example, like you know this, and I'll come back to my point in a moment, but just for momentum reasons. Let's say I've got a kid in front of me, and I think, you know what, this boy or girl, they keep turning up to the session, looking a bit sluggish, looking like they don't want to be there. So then as a coach, I make a decision. I'm going to need to control more things about about when they are here. I'm going to need to make sure I get my assistant coach to pair up with them to make sure that they're not misbehaving and to make sure they're focusing. The kid then, who actually might love the sport, but because you've perceived that kid to act in a way that suggests they don't, and because you're acting on your own perception, that kid then all of a sudden recognizes that they've got someone next to them. They recognize that you're given to a point treatment of them that's a bit more strict that compared to their peers. So then all of a sudden that kid actually becomes a bit rebellious because of that. That in turn creates a behavior where they stop wanting to be there and they start coming because of other reasons, because your relationship with them has polluted the environment. So you've actually, in a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, made their motivation what it is based on your perception. So that's why, maybe coming back to my point, I think what we need to be careful as coaches, we can consult and we can try and find out about our athletes, and once we do, and I think that's really important because the naked eyes got a bias as well. And we sometimes see more about ourselves when we look at a kid than what we necessarily see
Mm.
about the kid himself. And maybe we're maybe projecting our own backgrounds and things like that for that reason. But I would always try and just work and meet a player where they're at and use whatever their motivations are at that present time. Not, and again, in a way that we're trying to pull them closer towards internally driven reasons, but where we can at least try to work wherever they're at, where it be more extrinsic drivers, and then over time, can we add in internal drivers that maybe helps with the balancing of that scale? Because we have to in one end, and this is when I'm going to go back to the sort of literature side in support of it. We have to, in one end, listen to where there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that our outcomes, like more effort, persistence, enjoyment, even performance in some isolated case studies, to do with more internal drivers. But then it's back to the coach's side of it. We need to remember that any motivator can be useful if it's used appropriately. So let's say, bid bad, textbook says bid bad coach offering kids playing time in response for compliance with, putting effort into a drill, that they shouldn't do that. Well, maybe that's not a universal blanket term to do, but what if you've got that kid that's been dragged out of their car by their mum and dad? They don't want to be there just yet at that stage of their interaction with you. So maybe you need to work on where they're currently at. And you know what, if the playing the game is more interesting to them than the drill at that time, then do that. Same way of chatting to their friends at that moment of time is more interesting to them, then do that. And then as they start to like the environment more, you might then, and as you maybe start giving them some compliments and they start to then think more about actually the fact that they feel good in activity, all of a sudden your drill has more relevance to them. So like, you're working with an athlete where they're at, not trying to necessarily very quickly change them. And actually, I don't think change should be the outcome. It should the target. It should be just evolve them to maybe to inhabit where they're at, even in name motivators, but also integrate other motivations for why they want to be there too. I think that's a more realistic approach to working with players. And I think coming back to what coaches need to be able to do, it's a more pragmatic approach because there's constant tensions in coaching between what an athlete wants and what an athlete needs. And if we're always focusing on what an athlete wants, and that's often where again soft words around choice and autonomy and things like that can very easily, I think, for coaches lead them down a rabbit hole of trying to attain things that practically aren't easy to actually facilitate. And we might talk about different ways that we could actually view what autonomy and these. I've not really got into that just yet, but we might talk about that in turn. But they're also not necessarily what the athlete requires as well. And that's because I'm talking here as someone that's got a background in motivational theory, but that's a very siloed thought. It's a very siloed perspective that can't fully account for all the other perspectives that are also relevant in coaching for all the other types of skills and all the types of experiences that as a coach we need to put our athletes through. So there's a lot
And
of
so,
different things in
so
there.
I'm thinking now. I mean, just thinking about the kid who gets out of the car. So you've got 20 kids that get out of 20 different cars, and each one of them's going to be arriving with a range of things which have happened to them, and they've got expectations about the session, lots of different things. And the challenge I expect for the coach is to try and meet as many of them in the right place at one time. So I'm just going to throw in. I wouldn't say it's a controversial triangle, but it's a triangle which is often used, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now,
Mm.
my understanding is that it's not really a triangle. It's more a flow. So, for those who may be not familiar with the simple science of it, is that you have some basic needs, and once those basic needs have been satisfied, you're motivated by um, higher order needs like self-esteem and self-actualization. Now, I might be completely hammering the science here, but my understanding is that some people aren't that bothered by the basic needs. They want the self-esteem and vice versa. So given that you've got your first activity has got to try and meet as many of the different parts of the spectrum. Is this where I'm going now? A good coach obviously is jumping out, maybe getting into some players and saying some things to them, using assistant coaches and other players to do that. Is that the way that we should be going now? I mean, not. I mean, it sounds very complicated, but our first activity, we've got to try and get players up to a level. Is it? Am I going in the right direction here,
No,
or am I
yeah,
completely?
no, it's an interesting point. Now, what you bring up there, Dan. So, see, Maslow's sort of hierarchical needs, right? Now, this is what's interesting. This is what's can be quite difficult about motivational psychology and the way that we need to navigate it is that there are conflicting frameworks sometimes. Now, the one I've presented initially, self-determination theory, is almost sort of based on this assumption that we have these three psychological needs that are always important at all times, at all levels, to all rates,
Mm.
right? So, and I'm not saying I disagree. I do actually no, I do disagree with it, right? But I'll come back to why that is the case. So, if we talk about the three
You're not
needs,
allowed to have that hanging, but we'll definitely come
yeah,
back to that.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But so you've got these three needs, okay? You've got autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy being very quickly there around feeling in control of your behaviour, volitional in your actions, all that sort of stuff. Competence in a nutshell is feeling good at activity, feeling like you can get better at activity. And relatedness, which is also sort of termed like connectedness, is more around like interpersonal involvement, how people, how you, if you feel like you belong, like you feel like you're cared for by other people, to a point about how you feel you can care for others as well. So these are three needs that have came out of a lot of research. It started more in general psychology and has went across different domains like education, sport, health, all these sorts of things, right? Now, because of that, it's this big sort of giant, and it was coaching being a relatively young science as its own sort of discipline, then essentially got to a point where we went, right, we need to know more about, from the athlete perspective, motivation. So then you had self-determination theory being the framework that was imported into coaching in order to help us make sense of things, right? Now, the reason why I'm saying that, and because you asked around Maslow's stuff, is they're very different views on things because self-determination theory, like I said, believes in these three needs being mega important all the time and to the same level. Whereas Maslow's sort of hierarchical needs believes that you sort of is more about strength of motivation
Yeah.
at different levels. So there's almost like an assumption that beyond literally could it become mega fundamental at the most base level of Maslow's hierarchical needs pyramid. It's like about being alive and
Yeah.
subsistence and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then it's like as we move through a developmental track, you then reach a point where it's more advanced needs about self-actualization, creativity, novelty. I think is one of the ones that's put up there. Now, I personally am someone that like again, I'm going to move back and forward here between the perspectives, okay? Because as coaches, I think for your listeners, I think the challenge is for them to actually to figure out what sits best with them at different points of time. Now, I think there's a point to which competence, relatedness, and autonomy are always helpful to a point. Now, the reason for that, let's say, going back to that example of the kid, um, if we can't necessarily, and how we can meet a kid, that's been straddled out of the car and meet them where they're at, okay. In the same way how we could meet an athlete who's just motivated by money and meet
Mm.
them where they're at. But the kid example is a bit easier to explain this point. Self-determination theory is what we call a meta theory, so there's got lots of different wee individual theories that make it up. Now, the big one, there's one of the bigger ones of it's called, it's a fancy term. I'm only saying it just so you're aware of it. It doesn't really matter, but it's called organismic integration theory. So what that theory is based on is that it believes, suggests it's the self-determination theory is a positive psychology framework. So it believes that everyone has this sort of innate desire to consciously keep assimilating keep assimilating to this really whole self-integrated version of themselves, and that we're growth-minded creatures that we want to get better. Okay, now the reason I say that is that if you can't provide choice, for example, choice is really important because how can you actually be the most whole version of yourself if you don't feel in control of your own behavior? It's the most powerful need possibly in all humanity. Like wars are fought over the need for autonomy. Like, it's the most important need. You can scale it up or down whatever way you want. It's so important. But then you've got competence relatedness, and this is one of the myths around motivational theories that I can touch on here as I get back to your answer, is that which is I think it's important in order to explain it. We sometimes think that autonomy is the most important thing, but if again we look back to that kid being dragged out of their car, um, that kid to me actually one of the things that helps us internalize more extrinsic reasons at the time for wanting to be there can be because doing the activity, if it's not the activity itself that's of interest to us, it can be the fact that partaking in the activity helps us in our relationships with other people because that's another need, relatedness. Also, naturally getting better at activity that other people value. Maybe you as the coach, and maybe you're saying that to them, well done, you just done a good try. Or maybe the fact that their teammates all of a sudden like them and they become close to their teammates and it helps with bonding. All of a sudden these different needs integrate with each other. So that's why I'm saying in one context, believing that all the needs are as important at all times can be really helpful. But then we're talking about that coach that's working with wee tiny kids, to that coach that's maybe working with an under 18s team, to that coach that's working with national level athletes. Do all athletes require or even want autonomy? You know, is that I don't think an 8-year-old cares about being in control. They care. They might at least not in the way we think that they care. Does a kid turning up at our session feel that they have to have input in the activities that you do? Probably not. Do they care about being able to choose how long they can play a video game for when they get home with their mum and dad? Yes, but the context is different. So, but
And
again,
I think,
then
and I think that's right. So I'm just going to jump
yeah,
in, and
yeah.
I mean, I'm absolutely loving this and lapping it up because um, I think the autonomy thing in particular is interesting. So we do want people to have more choice. If they can, they can. But sometimes, as you say, they don't want it. They're actually happy for someone else to make the decisions for them, to get on and give them, right. I don't want to know whether I want vanilla or chocolate ice cream. Just give me the ice cream. I've had I've had a, you're not an 8-year-old says, I've had a hard day. I just want to stop making choices. But also, a lot of that is under the understanding that the person actually knows or understands why the choices are being made. And I'm not saying that an 8-year-old shouldn't be given some choices or shouldn't be given some autonomy, but it's the amount that they're given. We need to scaffold it to a certain extent because you don't know. And
Mm.
also, not every child arrives at under eights wanting to become the best player. On the other hand, not every child arrives just to have pure fun. Some are very serious. Their dream is to play for Rangers. And I've said that with a smile on my face because not every child wants to play for Rangers. Um, and therefore, if everyone else is having what might be perceived as fun, they're very frustrated because they're not achieving what they want to achieve.
Hmm.
So it is difficult for a coach to sort of get that right for every player. It's much easier, I think, to coach one on one in that situation because you've got that chance to build those relationships. So the reason that I think that I'm thinking about motivation here in particular is you're suggesting you're going to try and create an environment for them which allows them to maybe find where they are on the spectrum. And then you've got to drop in little pieces of or little activities or conversations which are going to just help them get to where they should be on that spectrum. Or am I
Yeah,
reducing
yeah.
that
No,
beyond?
no. So you could be doing that, yeah, and I think there's to a point that's helpful, but then it goes back to I think what you raised around Maslow's hierarchical needs. If we want to view things, and I think my professional experience has told me that there are, and this kind of goes hand in hand with scaffolding as well, because this is where the theories they try and argue against each other, but at the same time, so in some sense, I'm saying like Maslow, you can maybe once an athlete gets older, they start to want to have more autonomy and more input. So then as a coach, we can provide that. Even if, and this is what I mean, autonomy supportive coaching isn't a caricature of itself. Contracting, me asking you, Dan, do you want control? And you saying no, and me saying, right, do I have permission to take more control and be more directive and tell you what to do? That a contracting element of that is still being autonomy supportive. And then there's that, and this is what I mean, how people think they think too obvious around the way that in which autonomy is actually exhibited. Similarly speaking, should I be
So I'm just
putting,
going to stop you there. Again, I was probably just interrupting on your flow. So I'm just going to go back to that contract bit. Um, can I have permission to take more control? If you ask that of a player, how often would they say no?
yeah, and it depends on exactly how you set it up,
Yeah.
I would probably say
Because I think I
coaches.
really like that idea of asking permission to take more control, but the way that you say it, or even as you said it then, there's very few athletes say, no, actually, I don't want to give you
Mm,
permission because
yeah.
you would be that would break another sort of implicit contract you have between the trust of the coach and the player.
But
Uh,
that would be understanding who you're coaching then. So
yeah.
again, this is a case of like, and there's a really good paper around, I think Cliff Mallet wrote where he was coaching the Olympic team in Australia. I think it might be 2004 for the Olympic team, if I might be mistaken. But where that was a really great case example of autonomous supportive coaching. Now you're working with advanced athletes who understand a lot about their own performance,
Mm.
and because they might have the I don't know the confidence to a point to be able to actually speak as part of that and have that dialogue with you as a coach. Maybe and or you might look at tennis where the athletes hire coaches themselves. So, the coach becomes an employee of the athlete. Like there's always context that will determine that. What you are correct in saying, however, it's a bit like we can make the sense of autonomy actually false. It's like if I say to the kids, right, you can, if I say to a bunch of 10-year-olds, you can choose the activity tonight. You can either do this really rubbish one, which I think's to not be very good for your development, or you can do this really good one that
Yeah.
I've also planned. So that's
I
false,
like that sneaky approach. I use that.
Yeah, and there's like we could get back into this, but I think coming back to the previous point, what we're trying to do there is essentially make sure that we are both have an environment that's structured and an environment that still looks after autonomy to the point that the athlete wants it and to the point that they require it. Because as you said around scaffolding, for example, would it be responsible for me as a coach if I see things from an STD standpoint where I see everything as of equal merit and equal standing at all times, at all stages of an athlete's journey? Is it appropriate for me as the coach then to really double down on autonomy and provide independent work to a kid who maybe isn't actually able to do well in an independent space? Because then what happens is they then make mistakes or they fail, and I'm not getting into the whole pedagogy of mistake making. I know that we want that, but they then in a space where perhaps their perception of competence fails because you as the coach have actually overstated the importance of autonomy at all times. Autonomy support is it's in the word support. It's still a highly involved form of coaching. It's just not restrictive. So again, this is again one of these myths where people think autonomy support is just sitting back and letting people take control. It's not. But then, and again, I'm just saying this, and I'm not necessarily giving a clear answer here as such. So I don't think it's for
No,
the
no, no.
coaches, their
I
environment
think
to
there's
say it.
something.
But
Yeah, I think
that's
it's
why
very
it
important.
matters.
Sorry, I'm going to talk over you there. It's very important that you are thinking in terms of a bigger picture of what you're trying to achieve here. Because as you say, you can actually, by giving too much autonomy, actually demotivate because things go wrong all the time because you've said, but that was your choice and I've given you the choice. And they're constantly making those mistakes. And I've seen it, I've done it myself. Even more recently, I said, okay, well, let's go with that. And I should have said, we could have gone with that, but I'm gonna use my expertise now to say this is not going to work here. We may come back to this at a different time, and I think that's important that coaches do that.
And what happens, Dan, for example, and again, I'm not a rugby guy, but let's say you're coaching a scrum for the first time, or in an environment that, potentially that could be dangerous. Are
Yeah.
you saying you're going to allow, as a coach meant to, because they've been told athlete-centered coaching is the way to go and we need to offer input and decision make? Is a coach meant to not direct that practice, very and control that environment very closely? Same with like adventure sports coaches, where they're like working with people going down into, canyons of water and stuff like that. Like there's always this is the thing that I always say, come back to how we need to look at motivational theory. It's looking at coaching through a very narrow lens that has a lot of value and that we should consider, but we can't consider it. It's not about replacing all other considerations. It's about forming part of the way a coach assesses situations and how they develop relationships with people. So it's these are the things that are really, really important, I believe.
Yeah, I mean we're flying off in loads of different directions. So I just want to come back to something which I probably should have asked right at the start. What what does a motivated athlete do that a demotivated athlete doesn't do?
Okay, so, and I know it sounds like semantics, but that's, and again, just because I'm conscious the topic here is around myths.
Mm,
I think this is one of the obvious errors I see a lot of people make is that we exclusively talk about amounts of motivation. So when we get in a conversation where it's that athlete's motivated or that athlete's demotivated, what I think we need to consider as coaches about, well, what's the quality of the motivation? So there's amounts and qualities of motivation. So in this, I'm just using youth football or youth sport because that's my space. But the obvious one, sometimes if you ever ask a coach to appraise what they're doing and the environment they're creating, they go, well, I must be doing something well because the kids keep coming back each week.
mm,
Now, that's a conversation of high motivation to continue to partake, but is it actually good quality motivation? Why are they actually coming back? Are they coming back because they like what you're doing with them? They like the sport, they like the friends that they've made? Or are they coming back because they feel guilty? They come back because they're worried there's going to be a punishment from the parents if they don't. So
mm.
it's not always it's not always a very solid evidence to say that, persistence in activity itself shows good motivation. So again, I think we need to extend the conversation from amounts to amounts and quality for that reason.
So let's think about quality. So just coming back, I mean, often coaches will say, we've had a good season, we've retained most of our players, we've got more players arriving. And I mean, that's a great measure of success for a team because obviously you want to retain players. Uh, in terms of the quality, where the differences? What should we be looking for in differences? And how can we measure that? To well, I mean, to the extent that we can measure anything.
Yeah, so the initial thing that we spoke about that spectrum
Mm,
of different motivational types. So when I say quality, we get into types of motivation. So what I was talking about earlier on, and again, you didn't think I'm arguing against myself here, but I again would say that when you've got a lot of different motivational types and you've got a lot of, yes, let's go back to the kids that keep turning up. I think personally, it is okay to sometimes use extrinsic motivators and to sometimes be the coach that sometimes has the stick and not or the carrot, depending on how you go down that route, or to be the coach that sometimes is being the external motivator. Because again, let's say you're working in a developmental space, or let's just say you're working in a senior space as well. Would we be right to say to a coach that they should never make athletes feel a bit guilty, or they should never actually maybe enforce certain punishments because a framework says so, and because we've seen some correlations between that and some traits that have to do with health and well-being? We need to remember that a lot of within academia, a lot of every study is bounded to its own sample. And we are also in a space within motivational theory because it's still heavily influenced, and a lot of the evidence that we transfer into coaching is still from a general psychology space where it's, and again, not to use too fancy a word here, but it's very what we call positivistic, meaning that it's very um, quantified and it's very numbers based and very like hard data driven in that sense, that it's a lot about questionnaires and links and stuff like that. But you don't know anything about context through a questionnaire. And this is why so the point I'm trying to make here is that, and during my PhD I get there was an example, right, that I can come to around this. So at one point, what I look at more importantly, for me, what's more important, it's not, I say more important, but what I care about isn't just features of coaches' behaviours that have motivational implication. I actually care about the causes of the behaviours. So I like to look at influences, what actually makes a coach act the way they act, because I think within that we have a far better and fairer space to actually assess a coach in a way that's fair and not dogmatic and not idealistic. So I remember observing a academy coach in a performance context, okay? And the coach was working with full-time athletes, but they were, still kids, but, between that sort of 16, 18 age bracket, if you will. Um, and the goalkeeper had joined in the training a little bit. And the ball came back to the goalie, and not once, but twice. And then actually a third time, they misplayed a pass. Now the coach who was watching, and I was watching the coach watch the player. The coach went off his nut really. It just means was really angry, shouted, "I can't believe this! Come on, hurry up, pull it together!" For lack of more accurate words, perhaps. Now, me as a researcher writes down, oh well, the framework says that that's been very distant and cold. It's related as 14. It's all these different words that we attach to things. But then when you ask the coach, why did you do that behaviour afterwards? I find out that the coach knows that kid well enough because he's coached him from under 14s when he's first joined the academy, roughly. He knows that that player gets more down in the dumps when his teammates criticise him than when he does. So by him going in and giving them the blast then, it was to avoid the need or the field need from his teammates to criticise the player. Because that would have had a more jeopardising effect on that player's perception of competence, for example. So all of a sudden, is that still damaging behaviour by the coach? Because now we see the context in it. And when I come back to like when we're talking about quality of motivators and things like that, and how we then because it's a bit of a blueprint. A lot of stuff self-determination theory looks at it gives you a blueprint because if you want internal drivers, you're meant to do this behavior. But then it's a bit like, well, what do the kids or what do the person, what does the athlete need? I work in a developmental coaching space where I'm trying to teach, young boys, for example, about the importance of discipline, the importance of respect, in order to allow them to become potentially a professional athlete. So, see if a kid doesn't turn up in time, or it's persistently, and it's under their control. I want to make them feel guilty.
Mm.
See if a kid isn't respecting the core values of a club, in terms of the values that we know, having the foresight that a kid doesn't have, that if they want to make it as a professional athlete, that they need to honour and respect what a club, how a club expects people to behave and act if they maybe want to be in a first team changing room. They have to face similar consequence to their action as if we're trying to prepare people for the next stage. So this is where it's not simple, it's not a blueprint approach. And
Mm.
this is why I always say, and people get really caught up about, oh, don't encourage extrinsic. And it's like, well, why? And I think it comes from people probably not coaching long enough to really understand that, to be honest, but also just becoming too caught up in the dogma of their own language. And that the issue we have in coaching is, certainly within a motivational space, is we have almost unfalsifiable theories that are always explained away. And we can get into this further if you like, but it's a strange space because of that. And motivation's complicated because people are complicated. So it's ironic that we have very black and white terms for a very grey area in that sense. So
So when you're
that
talking about, I mean, we could go on for hours on here. So I'm going to tie things up quite quickly. But I'm just interested now that some of the things you're talking about, some people might be listening in and thinking, where does psychological safety fit into this? Because that coach shouting across at that goalkeeper at that moment, he understood that that would work better for that player, and the other players would have to react appropriately. Yet others would might be saying, well, where's the psychological safety here? Where does that player feel that if he can make a mistake, at least he knows he's in a safe space that he will be able to react positively to it as time goes on. He doesn't deserve to be shouted at that moment. There may be a better way of doing it. And I'm sensing that the researcher who was maybe ticking off the boxes was thinking that. So am I misunderstanding psychological safety in that sense? Um, is it important? And do we need to recognize that sometimes that people do need to be as has been suggested from that little bit of research, that sometimes they need to be felt made to feel guilty and need to have a little bit more stick than carrot.
Yeah, so it's a great point, Dan. So one of the this to me is why I think language is really important. So psychological safety is something that it's a very popularized term. Does it exist? Like, do we actually think in a space like sport, can sport ever be psychologically safe? Like, so you're in particular, like, so a kid or an athlete taking part in sport where there's winners, losers, where there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, there's a lot of challenge and upset and things like that.
Yeah.
How
You can
can
be
that?
dropped.
How
You can
can
be
that?
dropped from a team. You can be cut
Yeah.
from a squad. You
Yep.
can lose a season. I mean,
Yep.
there's going to be a whole range of disappointments
Yep.
along your road.
Yep. So, and this is, and what I'm saying here, and I think coaches are now captured by an ideology around psychological safety that I think is stopping coaches from being effective while still being caring. Because why can't you be both? Because and the reason I say that is that while there's a lot of talk that psychological safety is still meant to be like weighed up alongside the need to challenge people. I don't see this. I don't see a proportionate weighing of sort of promotional content around that. I don't see, I never see the promotion of challenging athletes anymore. I think you see, and we're in an age of athlete-centered coaching, again, whatever that's meant to mean. We're in an age of like coaching now where, and I'm talking about, again, we're talking about a theory, the main theory in psychology that in terms of motivational theory, self-determination theory, it's everywhere. Most of the studies I read is almost like a gotcha thing where we're trying to observe all these different bad behaviors in coaches. Again, correlationally, then putting them next to different outcomes. Again, often with numbers alone, then seeing like there was this X amount of percentage where there's all context lost. And what it risks creating is an audit culture on coaches where we aren't in a space anymore that we can be trusted to sensibly push athletes and sensibly know when to leverage different motivators at the different times. Now, I think the big reason why we're in that space is for all good reasons. Generationally speaking, we have came and made progress in coaching where people were just bad towards athletes and it was culturally accepted. And there's been a lot of case studies where there has been abuse in sport. That is 100% like the correct response to that. That we have to move more towards a place of care and as I say, reach some or attempt to reach some sort of standard of psychological safety. But what we're trying to temper here is, and it's a conversation almost around ethics beyond the legality of it. And this is why motivation, I think, plays a role in that, is because the way it's positioned is very formulaic and very blueprinty, as I say, and it's telling coaches that they must behave in this way and have to always not behave in another way. And this is the stuff that we could get into more an academic conversation here because I think that there's a lot of downplaying often where there's that sort of like weird surprising results in the data that uses self-determination theory, but it's always explained by things like culture and stuff like that, like all the arguments that tell us that's why we need to be contextualized in the way that we explore it, yet it's used as the explanation for not looking too further forward and not looking beyond the smoke screen as to why the data itself isn't necessarily telling us the things that they are wanting to conclude. So this is this is the weird space that we're in with motivational theory and how it's applied. And I think that's why I think I would encourage your listeners to be curious about it, but to be critical of it. So there's coaches can be better, but the researchers that also are informing coach behavior in this space of this sort of age of evidence informed behavior and evidence based, they can also be better because we're in this weird mix. Because coaching isn't like other disciplines, it's an applied relational act that's full of tensions all the time. It doesn't always, and it requires a lot higher order thinking that can't always be appropriately served by a blueprint, cookie cutter, do this all the time approach to coaching.
Well, we certainly haven't had we didn't have a blueprint for this podcast. I set you off on one question and we have gone in lots of different directions. I've
Apologies.
probably thrown questions in which have gone off and thrown the momentum. But Mark, it's been absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm guessing that some listeners will be thinking, "Wow, I need to think. Need to be more curious about this, and I need to think about how it's challenged some of the things I'm thinking, and I may wish to speak to Mark about these things, maybe to take the debate further. So." I'm sure people will want to listen or want to speak to you a bit more about how they're going to get in contact with you.
Yeah, no, thanks. And again, apologies. I do know I rant on sometimes.
Well, no, we like
And
a rant. We like a rant.
yeah, and it's a space, and I always come back to it. It's about tensions. I just think that we need to be, and sometimes it's important to almost, and I'm trying to deliberately sort of move towards one side of the fence where I think it hasn't had a lot of company in a while. So
Yeah.
that's just because I think that's important, and it's not to deny the opinions of the other side. It's just to create balance in that conversation. So yeah, if anyone wants to sort of reach out, I'm mostly active on LinkedIn. I do have other social media accounts on Instagram and TikTok. You might wonder why on earth is he in TikTok, but the reason for that is I've got a podcast in coaching, which is again, I think you alluded to, I think you said that at the start, Dan. Labours of Sports Coaching, where we hash out a lot of these topics, not just on motivation. Truthfully, I get a bit bored of my own subject, so and I don't have the attention span to stay on it all the time. So, and because I recognise there's actually a bit of a futility to it, because we need to consider again as an applied practice about all the different things we need to take into consideration. So, if anyone wants to listen to about motivation, but also doesn't want to listen to motivational theory, and maybe wants to touch on other topics, pedagogical, still acquisition minded, that sort of thing, then Labours of Sports Coaching is a space that you can maybe check out. But much like the great work that you're doing, Dan, and I think we need these sorts of mediums, and I think it helps reach people in a far better way than oftentimes just assuming that the everyday coach is going to have time to read one of my journal articles. Like how boring a life would that be? And also just I just don't think that's helpful because you lose the nuance in a lot of these things. And I think having a platform like you do and that you're providing right now, I think that's really important to inspire better practice and also in my case inspire better research. So yeah, so thanks for that. If that plugs that bit a little bit.
Well, that's brilliant. Well, I have really enjoyed it. I mean, I feel that if I was to reflect now openly, my questions were needed to be a little bit more focused on some of the things you were doing. I mean, you just threw out so many things I wanted to ask, and that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and there's so much more to talk about and think about. But just to wrap things up, you've been listening to a Rugby Coach Weekly podcast with me, Dan Cottrell. If you want to find out more, go to the rugbycoachweekly.net site and click on the podcast button to find out more about this podcast and all the other podcasts. And obviously, we are available on all the regular podcast platforms. Mark, thank you very much for your time and your non-rant and your expertise on motivation.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Dan. Thank you.
And thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We'll speak to you all very soon.
Thanks for listening to Rugby Coach Weekly Podcast. If you want to hear more podcasts, head over to rugbycoachweekly.net and click on the blogs tab to catch up on any episodes you've missed. We look forward to speaking to you again soon with more insights from coaches and experts from the world of rugby, sport, and learning.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're enjoying the insights and conversations we're bringing you, don't miss a beat. Hit that subscribe button. By subscribing, you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops, ensuring you stay ahead with all the latest content. Plus, it helps us keep bringing you the topics you love. So go ahead, subscribe now, and join our growing community of listeners. See you in the next episode.